So, where does the name Australia come from, and why are we called Australia? Now, it appears the answer is lost in the mists of time. Books started to be published in about 1492 in Europe, which just happens to be the date when Columbus became infamous or famous. And books are responsible for why he was so famous and why earlier explorers are not known. There weren't no books to publicize what was going on. With Australia, it's similar. And in the 1570s, we start to see the name Terra Australis appearing. And this is long before the Dutch went eastward. They went eastward after 1600. They called Australia New Holland. So first it was Terra Australis, then it was New Holland, and then it went back to being called Australia. Now, Terra Australis was also the name for Antarctica because it was thought to be joined to Australia. And it seems the earliest mention we can find, due to the fact that so many books have been destroyed and don't survive from earlier times, including written manuscripts, is a tract by a man. Basically, his name was Johannes Schöner, and he made a 1523 globe of the world, now lost, based on the Waldseemuller Map, and he wrote, Brasilia Australis is an immense region toward Antarcticum. So he's calling Brasilia Australis, Brazil obviously being a legendary lost land, towards Antarcticum, so he's differentiating it from Antarctica, newly discovered but not yet fully surveyed, which extends as far as Malacca and somewhat beyond. The inhabitants of this region lead good, honest lives and are not anthropophagi, cannibals, like other barbarian nations. They have no letters, nor do they have kings, but they venerate their elders and offer them obedience. They give them the name Thomas to their children, after St. Thomas the Apostle. Close to this region lies the great island of Zanzibar at 102 degrees and 27.3 degrees south. So it's a bit of a confusing description of Australia, but it seems to be a description of Terra Australis. Well, everyone, the more you go into this subject, the more complicated it gets, because it seems the Portuguese, according to this coin and a theory of McIntyre's, they discovered Australia in 1522 or 1525. I'm reading McIntyre's book now. It's very complicated about how the Portuguese discovered Java Le Grand. They plotted it. That's Victoria, Wilson's Promontory. Melbourne could be around there, all the way around. Fascinating. And he says they based this on the this theory is based on the maps, the Dieppe maps from France. There's Java Le Grand, Australia. There's Wilson's Promontory. Melbourne's down there somewhere. We see Aboriginals. We see weird tents, huts, interesting stuff. And they also plotted a bit of Western Australia, I believe, quite clearly under South America, because they weren't sure what to do with it. And this error has crept into the Schöner globes, as we shall see. That is, to me, that is Western Australia. That looks like the coastline to me, because they confused Australia with Antarctica. Antarctica was called Australia. So the first Schöner globe, and this kind of shows the Portuguese had a map of Australia before they went to Australia. No one's ever said that before. It's right there, and it's called Brasiliae Regio. Here's the Great Australian Bight. That's clearly the coast of Australia. And it's placed where Antarctica is because they didn't know where to plot this. They've also plotted it here, where it should be. But here they've plotted the east coast. So clearly the east coast was charted in 1515. This is Schöner's globe. He didn't know how big the Pacific was. He updated this in 1520, and he called it Brasiliae Inferior because it's under Brazil. This is from his globe, and that is clearly the coast of Australia here, clearly Gulf of Carpentaria, and there's the east coast. Someone has plotted it already by 1520, and the information has reached Germany, even though the Portuguese were supposedly keeping this a secret. Could be ancient maps. And here we have another update. This is a reconstruction. Wikipedia does not give me the source of this, and it's very hard to read, but to me, clearly here, it says To me, I believe that could say Terra Australis. And this is a reconstruction of the 1533 Schöner globe. There's another map of Australia there. And it's so interesting. So to me, this is clearly the first mention of Australia, 1533, or his 1530 mention, which was updating this globe, where he changed the name from Brasilia Inferior to Brasilia Australis. And then he could be using the words Terra Australis here, but I'll have to wait to see where this map actually comes from. Anyway, do check out McIntyre's book if you want. I've bought a copy. It's a bit expensive, but there you go. And later on, it became known as Terra Australis on maps, and it was joined to Antarctica. And this made Captain Cook very curious about it, and he tried to find it, and he discovered that as it was drawn, it did not exist. So it became New Holland, and Captain Cook refers to it as New Holland, and Captain Cook never actually called Australia, as it's now known, Australia. He thought Australia was actually Antarctica, which was the old name of Antarctica, and this is a reason why they say Antarctica wasn't discovered until very recently. That's actually a myth, because it was only called Antarctica very recently. Before that, it was well known. Now, Cook called the east coast New South Wales, the entire east coast, because it wasn't drawn on the Dutch maps, so it couldn't be New Holland, so it was a new country. He didn't call it Australia. But before him, William Dampier in 1600, who 100 years before Cook did an expedition to Australia. He was a pirate, an explorer, and a scientist. He wrote excellent diary entries which were published in a book called A New Voyage Around the World. And Dampier, he drew the flora and fauna of New Holland, and funded by first the Royal Navy, later the Royal Society, did several expeditions to New Holland. He only got as far as New Guinea. Everything conspired to stop him from getting there. The fact he was out of season to go around South America. He had to take the longer route around Africa. He had shipworm. He had a badly built ship. He ran out of water. He couldn't find water on the West Australian coast. He was unable to discover the east coast. And basically, he called it Terra Australis in his book. Cook called it New Holland. But after Cook, Flinders Petrie, who circumnavigated Australia by keeping away from the reefs. He kept quite far from Australia. Sorry, not Flinders Petrie. Matthew Flinders, the grandfather of Flinders Petrie, the archaeologist in Egypt, he wrote a book called A Voyage to Terra Australis. And this book was so influential, the authorities in New South Wales started referring to Australia after 1800 as Australia. And they drew the east coast as Australia, they drew the west coast as New Holland for the next 50 years. Then New Holland disappeared from the map and we reverted to Australia, which was the name since the end of the Middle Ages, or even in the Middle Ages, but all the manuscripts are lost, information is lost. So all this is lost in the mist of time. As far as Cook was concerned, he had disproven the existence of Australia, which was this continent joined to Antarctica. He said, well, that continent, as it's drawn, doesn't exist. There's just Antarctica and there's just New Holland. That's what Cook said, so he couldn't call it Australia in his opinion. But because it was drawn as Terra Australis, where Australia was on the old maps, it quickly reverted back to being Australia as the Dutch lost their influence and the English weren't interested in calling it after the Dutch name of New Holland, which was actually a more recent name than Australia anyway. So there we go, the convoluted and confused mystery of why Australia is called Australia. It went from being called Great Java, and in fact I'm reading in another book that the Portuguese also called it India Meridional, which means basically north to south India. So India, Asia stretching north to south all the way down to the south. And then it was Australis, then it was New Holland, then back to Australia. So there we go. That's why it's called Australia. Just unbelievable, the history behind that. There we go.